Hi, this is Andre. I want to talk about the Rehearse function on the Echoplex Digital Pro. Rehearse involves a particular way of working with feedback. So before we get specifically into Rehearse, I want to do a refresher course on feedback and specifically talking about what it means to have zero feedback. So just to review, if we record a loop, the default setting for most loopers, including the EDP, is that it will keep repeating at the same volume forever and ever until you turn it off. The feedback control is located on the knob right next to the front display. If we bring it down, the loop starts fading out. So feedback has to do with how many times the loop repeats. Now, if I overdub new stuff into this loop with feedback still set halfway down, then you can hear that each time the loop repeats, it's gradually a little quieter. If you've ever worked with a delay or an echo effect, then you're familiar with the idea of feedback because that determines how many times you're going to get the echo to repeat. So feedback kind of comes from the long delay school of looping. If you bring feedback back up to 100% while you have something recorded, let me overdub some more notes. If I bring it back up to 100%, now it's going to freeze the loop in that state, and if I overdub new stuff on top of that, that's going to stay at 100%. And if I bring it down again, it starts fading out. That kind of idea. Now, zero feedback has to do with bringing it all the way down. And if you do that, then you will only get one repetition. So I'm going to play one note on the guitar. You hear one repeat, and that's it. Zero feedback means you only get one repetition of whatever you play. That kind of idea. Now, with all that said, let's finally get to the Rehearse function. Rehearse is an insert mode. If you come down to the second parameter row, on the insert column, RHR is Rehearse. It's one of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 insert modes. And it's actually the default insert setting. So if you reboot the Echoplex from its factory default, Rehearse is the insert mode you're going to get. What Rehearse does in its primary form is act as an alternate ending to record. And what it does is, as soon as you finish recording a loop, it immediately puts you into a state where you are overdubbing with zero feedback. Let's demonstrate that. Here's recording a regular loop. I started by pressing record, which on this MIDI controller is pedal number 1. I finished recording with a second press of record. Now I'm going to do the same thing, but this time instead of ending with record, I'm going to end with Rehearse. Button number 4 on this MIDI pedal is programmed to do whatever the front panel insert mode is. And again, the front panel insert button is currently set to Rehearse. That means that pedal number 4 on this bank is also going to do Rehearse. So I'm going to record a loop from scratch. Instead of ending with a press of record the way I normally would, I'm going to end with a press of the insert button. Let's see what happens. And then it only repeats once. That's because Rehearse ends record and puts you into a state where you are overdubbing with zero feedback. The idea here conceptually is that this gives you a way to literally rehearse your loop and lock yourself into a groove or a pattern or a texture that you like before committing to having that repeat over and over again. So the main way that I've heard Rehearse described is, let's say I want to set up some kind of rhythmic feel, and let's say it's maybe going to take me a little while to get into a groove. With me personally, that's always a very real possibility. So I'm going to try and set up something rhythmic. I'm going to end with Rehearse instead of ending with record. So now I'm playing the same basic figure, but you can hear there's a little bit of flamming going on because my timing is a little loosey-goosey. That sounds okay. Now hit it a second time. When you hit it a second time, That takes you out of your zero feedback overdub state and puts you into a regular state with 100% feedback. So let's review that. Let's record an initial loop and end with rehearse. So now there's two things happening. The EDP is overdubbing with zero feedback, and I'm also playing the same pattern live. So if you hear a little flamming, that's the timing difference between my live performance and the one repetition that we're getting out of the loop. If I stop playing, we get the one repeat, and then it stops. There we go. And hitting it a second time takes us out of the zero feedback overdub state and puts us into a state where feedback is back to 100%. And from here, we can build up the loop the way we normally would. And so forth. Let's do that a couple more times just so that let's do that a couple more times. That sort of thing. Let's do that a little more. You may rightly ask what happens with rehearse if you have already recorded your loop. The answer is that it basically becomes an insert mode, which we talked about quite a while ago on the videos, but let's do a quick refresher course. Here's a one cycle loop, using rehearse to try and get a solid groove. It's okay. It's alright. So now if I use rehearse again, now that we've built up a loop, it starts inserting other cycles. Which is basically what the insert mode does in its most basic sense. We've talked about the insert mode in a lot of detail in some previous videos, so if you're not familiar with that, it's there to check out at your leisure. The only person I've ever heard of or encountered who actually uses the rehearse function is the person who invented it, Matthias Grob. A big part of Matthias's concept of looping and his playing style has to do with using feedback in incredibly subtle and musical ways. I have sat in front of Matthias watching him perform, hearing this amazing, beautiful, evolving, organic sound coming out, and having no idea how he does it. I mean, Matthias, when I saw him, literally had a custom feedback pedal with an overdub button built into the big toe. So there was a little overdub switch there. He would play barefoot or in socks, and he would be working the feedback pedal constantly, and he would be kicking in overdub just using his big toe while he was evolving feedback. So feedback is a huge part of how Matthias thinks about looping, and it's a huge part of looping in general. You know, I would say anybody who is coming from the long delay school of looping, anybody who has tried using a delay as a looper, has dealt with feedback. So feedback is a huge part of how Matthias thinks about looping. I think I remember his saying once that something between 1/3 and 1/4 of the entire processing power of the Echoplex was just dedicated to feedback and just dedicated to getting feedback to work smoothly. So feedback's a big part of what this thing does. And I would say the rehearse function is a particular way of accessing feedback. So instead of having to end record with overdub and kick feedback down all the way to 0, and then kick it back up to 100% and come out of overdub, you can basically do all that stuff with a couple of presses of the rehearse button. So on the one hand, it might seem very kind of rarefied and niche. On the other hand, I would say this. I'm recording this video in June of 2018, and a couple of months ago, Matthias posted on social media that it was the 25th anniversary of Matthias debuting the Paratus loop delay, which was the original progenitor of the EDP. I don't know the history terribly well, but my impression is that he debuted the Paratus loop delay. Shortly thereafter, he licensed it to Gibson, and Gibson made some modifications and changes to it with people like Kim Flint, and it ended up becoming what we know and love as the Echoplex Digital Pro. I mentioned this because basically I am still playing catch-up with the stuff Matthias was working on a quarter of a century ago. I'm still getting my head wrapped around some of the concepts in the EDP. I'm still finding new understandings of how this stuff works, how I could potentially use it. Feedback specifically is an area that I have a lot of work to do just myself as a player. There's a lot more I could be doing with it. So on the one hand, it might seem like Rehearse is a really kind of rarefied, fringe kind of effect, which in some ways is probably true. The other thing I would say is that I and so many other people are still playing catch up with the stuff Matthias was working on 25 years ago. So the fact that it might be rarefied to a lot of us doesn't mean that it doesn't have use. It doesn't mean that it couldn't be implemented in a lot of different ways for a lot of different players. It just means that Matthias Grob was very ahead of the curve, and I hope he has been patient while he waits for the rest of the world to catch up with him. Thank you so much, Matthias, for making this stuff possible. And thank you for tuning in. This has been a refresher course on feedback, zero feedback, and the rehearse function in the Echoplex Digital Pro. Thank you so much for tuning in. I will talk to you guys soon. Bye-bye.